Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Kristen Schaefer, and I'm the director of CHE, the Collaborative for Health and Environment. Thank you so much for being here, and we're very excited for today's conversation. Before we get started, I'd like to hand things over to Angie Schiavone of Full Circle Interpreting, who will explain logistics for those taking advantage of our simultaneous translation for today's webinar. Angie?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Angelina Schiavone, and I'm with Full Circle Interpreting. Please bear with us for one moment while I make a quick announcement in Spanish about the availability of Spanish interpreting services. Hola, bienvenidos a todos a este seminario en línea. Estaremos ofreciendo servicios de interpretación el día de hoy. Para utilizar ese servicio, por favor, hagan clic en el icono redondo de un mundo que aparece en sus controles de Zoom y luego elijan el canal de español. Si están conectados en una tableta o un teléfono, por favor vayan a los 3 puntitos que aparecen en su pantalla, luego elijan interpretación, español y finalizado. Gracias y que tengan una gran reunión. Thank you. I've gone ahead and made the announcement for interpretation services, and it's back to you, team.
Great. Thank you so much, Angie. Now I'll get us started with a few bits of housekeeping. We invite you to put a note in the chat introducing yourself and where you're joining in from, if you'd like to. There will be no slides after our introductory section, but you'll find resources and the full bios of today's speakers on the webinar page on our website at healthandenvironment.org. We'll add the link to that webinar page into the chat in just a bit. Please type your questions into the Q&A box at any point during the conversation, and we'll get to as many comments and questions as we can after the panel discussion. We'll do our best to monitor the chat as well, but your questions may get lost there, so we do encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to activate closed captions, you can do that by clicking the button on the bottom of your screen as well. This webinar is being recorded. Everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording, and it will also be available on the CHE website. Today's discussion is scheduled to last an hour and 15 minutes. With that, I'll move us into today's discussion. This webinar is part of a series highlighting the life cycle health harms of plastics and what can be done to address this problem. Our first webinar in early May of this year, just before the second negotiating session of the Global Plastics Treaty, highlighted the strong body of evidence linking exposure to toxic chemicals that are used in plastic production or created during use or disposal with serious human health effects. We also explored the process and politics of the treaty negotiations. In our second webinar in June, we discussed a new report on the chemical footprint of a plastic bottle, hearing from both a report author and an organizer in a community where plastic bottles are produced. This discussion highlighted the disproportionate impacts of plastic production on people of color and in low-income communities in the United States. We'll drop the links for both of these webinars in the chat in just a bit. Our goal for today's webinar is twofold. First, we hope to demystify the global treaty a bit for those who care about the health harms of plastics but haven't been following the process closely. And second, we aim to highlight why this treaty is relevant to people in Fenceline communities whose health is directly affected by toxic chemicals across the plastics life cycle, and how the upcoming negotiations in Nairobi can help promote environmental justice. You'll hear about the zero draft that the upcoming meeting will focus on, and why it's so important to have a strong starting document since compromises will be made as negotiations move forward. So we have some wonderful speakers lined up for you, including my colleague and friend Charles Patton, who will frame up the discussion and moderate for us today. Charles directs the Biomonitoring Resources Center at Commonweal and has many years of experience in international policy arenas, including the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, where we had the opportunity to work together many years ago. She also co-chairs the EDC Strategies Partnership and is a member of the CHE advisory team. Charles has been tracking the plastics treaty process closely and attended the first 2 international negotiating committee meetings, or INCs. Charles, it's my pleasure to hand it over to you to take things from here.
Thank you very much, Kristen. The plastic treaty stakes, as you can see, the plastic production is expected to triple by 2050. Billions of metric tons are projected here, you can see on this slide. So there's something like 16,000 chemicals used to produce plastics. Most of them have not been tested for effects on human or ecosystem cells, but the ones that have been tested are related to many adverse effects that are incredibly serious. One I'm particularly concerned about is infertility, for example. There are many cancers, neurological problems in children, for example, is another one. Decrease in the immune system to defend itself from diseases. It's a very long list depending on the chemicals you're looking at, depending on the mixtures and how that all works. But clearly plastics serve as a medium to move these chemicals around the world, and therefore creating a higher risk to the human race and the ecosystems for getting these diseases. Next slide, please. So let's just go briefly through how these meetings have happened. And just to say, first off, that the United Nations Environment Assembly, which meets twice, two times, once every 2 years. I haven't had my coffee yet, you did. Sorry, everybody. To decide what the work should be of UNEP. And so they were very much involved in putting together what the issues would be for the Plastics Treaty. But the Plastics Treaty is also preceded by 3 other treaties created by UNEP having to do with toxic chemicals. One is the Basel Convention and the Rotterdam Convention. They were deeply concerned with the fact that wealthy countries were tending to dump toxic plastics waste on countries that had less resources. And one, of course, the Rotterdam had to do with prior informed consent, that countries had to be well informed about what was going to be shipped to their shorelines and give approval before that. And then, of course, the Stockholm Convention that entered into force in 2004 looked at all the tried to look at as many toxic chemicals as possible to get them regulated, and with a view that they would be reduced and eliminated eventually. So these kind of treaties means that we have a lot of delegates coming that have experience with these treaties, have experience with assessing toxic chemicals and ways of exposure. So for the INC1, this is basically setting the stage, and delegates got together to try to define what the main issues were. Protecting ecosystem and human health was one that needed to be brought more clearly into a view at that particular point. INC2, we're getting into the substance. It was basically a discussion of the main issues relating and eventually to what would be a zero draft, a list of options that would be related and discussed further. Basically, legally binding control provisions that would call for the elimination of toxic chemicals throughout the life cycle of plastics, and mandatory publicly available and accessible disclosures of information on chemicals used in plastics. All right, so then INC3, which is coming up in a few days, basically, beginning November 11th, I think is the first formal meeting. It's tasked with putting together a document that will be basic for negotiations, hopefully move into negotiations. They go on to the next 2 INCs for further clarification and the really kind of nitty gritty of give and take and compromise. Not sure that a negotiations document will be created, but that is indeed the sense of what the task is for that particular, the INC3. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here's a timeline. You can see it's meant to be really, really quick. We just put that really quickly so you get an idea. Go ahead. Next slide. So it's important to have really strong points because, as you know, there's a lot of give and take and compromise. So the treaties will try to put very stringent, very almost ambitious, as the intent of methods to control toxic chemicals in plastics, the plastic wasteland. So we'll see how it goes. But you want as strong language as possible so that there is a way to start. And many many of the civil society, as you can see in the slides, the scientist coalitions, and some governments are pressing to address very strongly human and ecosystem health across the life cycle.
We have some great speakers that are going to be in conversation with us today. I'll start by introducing Yvette Arellano. Yvette is the founding director of Fenceline Watch, an organization dedicated to eradicating the harms of toxic chemicals among communities living along the fence line of the fossil fuel industry in the Houston, Texas area. Yvette is a Mexican-American Gulf Coast organizer with over a decade of experience advocating for immigrant reproductive food access and environmental justice. So Yvette, welcome. Happy to have you with us. I'm going to pin Charles as well. There we go. We also have with us David Azoulay. He's the managing attorney of the Center for International Environmental Law's Geneva office and the director of CL's Environmental Health Program. David studied public international law in France and Spain before specializing in environmental law. Working with various coalitions and networks, David has over 15 years of experience engaging in the negotiations of environmental international legal frameworks, which you'll hear more about during the discussion. Welcome, David. Happy to have you with us. And Serene Rashid is the plastics policy coordinator for the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. And Serene is, she's also worked on waste policy issues under the UN Environment Assembly and the Basel Convention, and is following the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations closely. She also has experience investigating political conflict and human rights violations in the Middle East and North Africa with the International Crisis Group and Amnesty International. Welcome, Serene. Charles, I'll hand it back to you to lead us into the discussion.
We want to start asking questions to everyone, and everyone will be responding to the questions. We're going to start with the first question, which is, how would you describe the Plastics Treaty to someone who isn't familiar with this? And David, we'd like you to start with your response to that.
Sure. Thanks very much, Cheryl, and hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I think the first thing to remind ourselves is that this is about a negotiation of an international legally binding instrument, a treaty. Quick reminder that treaties create obligations for states, not for individuals or for private entities. It's the states who are then in charge of implementing those various obligations on the people under their jurisdictions, people and entities under their jurisdiction. So the objective set out for this negotiation is quite ambitious. It's about putting an end to plastic pollution, nothing less than this. And we define plastic pollution as all emissions and risks arising from the production, use, and disposal of plastics. Of course, not everyone in this negotiations understands plastic definitions the way I just described it, and many people want just to talk about the visible part of the plastic pollution, just the plastic waste that litters our environment. But this is not how we're seeing it, and this is not the mandate that was given to us. So in effect, this is a unique opportunity to adopt global rules to regulate all harmful aspects of plastic production, use, and disposal. And I think Serene will say a little more about this after I do. But in addition to this, this is also a chance to address some of the shortcomings of existing international governance, whether it's on chemicals, climate, food production, because plastic is a key aspect of the multiple crisis, the triple environmental crisis that we're dealing with. And it's a key building block of the petrochemical industry. It's also a lifeline of the petrochemical industry. So as such, this process from a civil society perspective, movement building perspective, this is also an opportunity to take advantage of the unique way plastic is a material that everybody is familiar with, and the way plastic captures the attention of the public, and to bring together, to create momentum and brings together various movements and create long-lasting bonds between the movements that are fighting for a toxic-free world, for a climate-safe world, the movement working on ocean, the movement working on biodiversity, on food production, on safe and equitable working conditions for everyone. So this is really this sort of large, unique opportunity to negotiate this international treaty. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you, David. Let's go to Yvette. Yvette, do you want to add something to this? How would you describe the plastics treaty to someone who wasn't familiar with it?
I would say the Global Plastics Treaty is an opportunity to tackle plastics throughout its entire life cycle, like what David said. And, giving people not only relief when it comes to communities that live next to landfills, communities across seas that sort the plastic and push it into incinerators, but also we're talking about in the stores, talking about the plastics feedstocks that go into refineries, oil and gas compressing stations that then release toxics into communities. We're talking about fracking communities that have to struggle with the perpetuation of the fossil fuel industry. So it's an opportunity to increase transparency and identify and prohibit toxics that cause toxic multi-generational harm. This harm can range from asthma and other upper respiratory issues. It tackles toxics that harm the reproductive system, that cause developmental issues, neurological issues, and other problems that affect the nervous system. The US State Department would love to have the general public believe that they support a global plastics treaty to curb the plastic crisis, when in actuality, they are pushing national action plans saying, this is our problem, we can tackle it here at home, when in reality, a treaty could actually resolve the problem, because it would also go to tackling issues we face here at home when it comes to corporate capture, when it comes to unlimited lobbying and resources, and a global legally binding instrument seen through a human rights lens could address human rights issues that affect not only us, but the environment that we live in.
Thank you, Yvette. That's very, very important words from you. Serena, what will you tell people about the treaty?
Thank you. I just want to add that I feel the treaty is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to tackle those plastics from the extraction of raw materials all the way to the end of waste management and to plastics in the environment, right? Because plastics and the pollution that comes with them, they don't respect planetary boundaries, they don't respect national borders, they don't respect the borders of our bodies. And this is really a chance to tackle it in a really coherent way, which other international agreements at the moment don't do, right? We have, at best, partial coverage of some of the waste aspects under the Basel Convention. And it's rare that we really have the opportunity like this to regulate a family of chemicals, a material, in such a coherent manner. And one particular thing that I want to add is that we have the opportunity with this treaty to also adopt some benchmarks for what we want to do with these plastics and that plastic pollution that include human rights, that include environmental justice, and that include just levels for our planetary boundaries. And I want to focus in particular on climate, because let's remember that most plastics are made from fossil fuels. And plastics are kind of the evil twin of the other evil fossil fuels, right? And so this treaty is an opportunity for us to have the chance to honor our pledge to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we don't do that, and the main way to do that will be through reducing production, if we don't do that, then we're kind of signing our collective death sentence. Thank you.
Very good points, yes, indeed. Okay, so for the next question, what are some important aspects of the treaty? And what does this mean to the work that you do? Yvette, you want to take that on?
Thanks, Cheryl. Well, for someone like me in the environmental justice space, our community is dotted by these chemical facilities. We have a 52-mile stretch composing the largest chemical complex in the nation. It has over 618 chemical manufacturers along the Houston area. We have 252 risk management plant facilities. These are the kinds of facilities that hold hazardous material and can blow up. So what the plastics treaty means to me and my community is really getting to the core of this issue. It gives us a roadmap. INC3 will give us the roadmap for the rest of the treaty process and an opportunity to tackle toxic harm. And that's our focus, is toxic harm, because harm that comes to us right now, whether it is something, I don't want to say as simple as asthma, but something less severe is one thing. When that genetic code, when those mutations that these toxics cause get passed on to our children and our children's children and our children's children's children, then we have a massive societal problem that not only is hindered by a lack of healthcare access, but really goes to the heart of the long-lasting human harm that we see in vulnerable communities like mine. For me, this plastic treaty has three main core issues I really want to get to the heart of, which is reducing supply by capping production. We have to tackle this problem from upstream. It can't be something where once plastic enters the ocean, all of a sudden it's a problem. It's been a problem for communities in fracking areas and petrochemical areas. So controlling and managing the problem is one. So we can also meet that threshold and not go over 1.5 degree temperature rise. The second one, banning and phasing out or reducing problematic and avoidable plastics. We're not talking about medical life-saving plastics. We're talking about the kind that once you use it, it becomes trash. So we need to get to the core of what are these easier to control plastics. And then the third one would be we need to ban and phase out and reduce the production and consumption and use of chemicals and polymers of concern. The research is there. We've already been able to successfully tackle chemicals like PFAS, and this is why the general public is so concerned. We keep on having recalls, we keep on having health issues in our communities. What's stopping us from finally prohibiting the use and sale of things like Teflon products in our stores when we have the science and the research already being established? So for us here on the petrochemical end, we're going to be looking at the Global Plastics Treaty and focusing on three core obligations. And that's going to be obligations 1, 2, and 3 for folks who are interested in reading what I'm speaking about. I'll go ahead and drop a link in the chat.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask you, Yvette, a question about what kind of relationship you have with any of the companies that surround your neighborhoods. Do they provide you with any kind of monitoring of air or water or soil or human? Do they react to anything? I mean, how do you talk to them? And how do you think this treaty might give you more leverage with them, or would it?
Transparency. One, I understand that we already have existing facilities all along our communities, but we have absolutely no idea what's coming out of those smokestacks. And so often we smell the smells, we feel the headaches, we feel tired, sensations to vomit, and we have absolutely no information over what's in the air. You can't see it, so how could you fully identify it? When we do seek any sort of resolve, either the city or the county tells us that these chemicals are so harmful, they don't want to put their employees at risk. So we end up not having any answers at the end of the day. So companies like ExxonMobil, Shell, they keep on reaping profits. And we see absolutely none of those resources reestablishing communities, whether it's jobs that more often than not go to contract workers that are not union workers, have no benefits. We see increases of explosions because you have a tired workforce. You have folks who are already experiencing toxic exposure who are potentially also bringing it home. When you wash your clothes with your children's clothes. Those toxics transfer over. So all we're seeing are the negative effects, right? The costs that aren't being shuffled over to industry are being paid by an everyday person in my community, whether it's in bloated hospital visits, lack of healthcare to access, missed school days because the schools have no nurses on staff, and parents can't administer medications to their children's. So we live in fear, we live in harm's way, and we need some resolve to keep this problem at bay.
Yes, I hope this treaty gives you some leverage, and I hope that all of us are behind you and can help as much as we all can to make this happen. It absolutely has to happen. Absolutely ridiculous. Trudy, just a question for you. What do you say when people say, well, what are the substitutes for plastics, given the everybody in households is full of plastic, this plastic, that they rely on, is cheap, it's easy to get their hands on. What do you say when they say, what will be the substitute for the kind of goods that are now made in plastic? What other materials would be available?
Is that a question for me?
If you could say no, I
Yeah.
don't want.
Sure, no, for sure. Okay. So if it's okay, before I take that, I did wanna echo something that Yvette just said. This treaty gives us the opportunity to control chemicals and plastics, and chemicals and plastics, the ones that cause the toxic impacts, are out of control. There's currently more than 13,000 chemicals in plastics, and most of them, we have no adequate data on their safety for health or for the environment. And so with this treaty, we could have not only transparency, but controls, meaning when there is no data establishing safety for health and the environment, those chemicals should simply not be used. Right now, humans and ecosystems are being used as guinea pigs for individual chemicals and their toxic cocktail effects that are in plastics and that leach from plastics into our bodies and into our environment. Coming back to the question of substitutes, one really important thing for us at Gaia, we work on zero waste, and we've been working on that for a long time. And that means, how do we maximize the avoidance, the reuse, the repair, and in last instance, the recycling of products and materials in our economy, right? How do we have an economy that is less focused on material extraction and more focused on green jobs and labor and more regenerative? So that's why under the Plastics Treaty, we're really not pushing for a mass scale switch from plastics to another material that would be single use. And we're very, very concerned to see that many parties are saying, oh, let's just go from fossil-based plastics to bio-based plastics, or let's just go from plastics to aluminium. That is just going to shift the burden elsewhere. It's not going to resolve the problem. Because the problem is a problem of over extraction and consumption and production of material resources. It happens to be plastics, which are material resources that are very hard to manage. But we really want to see this treaty centering reduction, avoidance, and reuse systems. We really think that it's the opportunity to shift the paradigm. Shifting the substance, shifting the material itself is not going to be enough. It's not going to cut it. And we know that this economy of resource extraction is toxic in many ways, right? We know the environmental cost, we know the health cost. There's a war cost, there's a colonialism cost, right? I mean, what's going on right now in Gaza and Israel is tied to Western appetite for fossil fuels in the Middle East. Let's not deceive ourselves. So what we have here is really an opportunity to shift systems. And for that, it's really important that we don't stop at recycling. Some of you are based in the US, some of you are based in California. You might be familiar with the work of Roland Geyer in industrial ecology. He used to be the biggest advocate of recycling, and he has come to the conclusion after all his career that the way forward is reuse and avoidance and repair, and recycling must come in the last instance, right? His latest study came out this week. It shows that curbside recycling for households actually incentivizes more consumption, right? We really have to shift, obviously focusing on well-being and equity, but we really have to shift to an economy that centers labor and reuse and repair first. And there's a name for this, there's a framework for this, it's the zero waste hierarchy.
Thank you. Thank you. A brilliant answer. Thank you very much for your wisdom here. David, just for you and part of this section, talking about what can be done with plastics and with chemicals, does the issue of come up ever with the idea that maybe it's not confined to those kinds of things, but changing the system so that we wouldn't need water in plastic bottles brought to our communities if the water systems worked in terms of cleaning up the water or making sure the upstream pollutions were stopped? Is there kind of a sense that might be some systemic change that would help get rid of plastic chemicals and plastic use when it's laden with chemicals and carrying them around the world? Does that make sense to you, David? Is that the kind of question that ever comes up?
There's a short answer to that question. Is the short answer is yes, absolutely. And in fact, if I want to expand a little on this, it's to say that's the only way forward. We know that we have to get out of our fossil fuel dependency. And currently, plastics and petrochemicals in general represent the lifeline from the oil and gas and petrochemical industry. They're not even being secretive about this. There are very clear public-facing memos from the oil and gas and chemical industries that explain that as the world is trying to shift away from using fossil material as fuel, their next step, their next relay of profit is to produce more plastics and more chemicals and more petrochemicals. So clearly, there is a need to change that. And as Cyrine was saying, the only way out of this is not to just change the way just change the materials that we use, but it's really to change the way we consume and the way we produce and the way we distribute the different goods and services that we use around the world. When we started this conversation, well, I mean, when the conversation started at the international level, a bit under 10 years ago, plastic was really seen as a waste issue and as an ocean issue. Clearly now, the world has moved on to understand that plastic is first and foremost a consumption issue and a production issue. And so, yes, the need for systemic change is at the basis, at the root of what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Okay, our last question, I believe, is what are some of the hurdles to progress? What's needed to get to the outcomes we need? And Serena, could we start with you on this one?
Absolutely. So I'd say the first hurdle we have, and we have been having since the start of the negotiations, has been a procedural hurdle that, again, I'll come back to the parallels with Israel and Gaza. Same reason why we got a UN General Assembly resolution, and we have had nothing out of the UN Security Council. There are some countries that want to remove the opportunity for a vote once efforts at consensus during the negotiation have been exhausted. And as we see in the UN Security Council, when you have consensus, it means one country can block everything, even in the most critical circumstances. And that is why we really hope and work for this issue to be resolved in a way that preserves an option for a vote when consensus is exhausted. And that's how many environmental agreements work, right? We're not proposing anything new or revolutionary there, but predictably, actors who have very low ambitions for this are trying to suppress the option of a vote so that we don't have a treaty that threatens any of the institutional and economic interests that are associated with the plastics production chain. fear, I don't know what my co-panelists would think, I fear that a weak treaty that would be agreed only by consensus might be worse than no treaty. Obviously, it'll depend on the content, but a weak treaty that would greenwash plastic production and big polluters would be a very, very big threat in my view, and could be a gigantic waste of time. And it is our mission to make sure that this does not happen.
Okay, Yvette, would you like to respond to this? What are the hurdles, biggest hurdles, do you think?
Access has been one of the largest hurdles through this treaty. Even though this treaty is open to civil society, that doesn't encompass every treaty conversation. In fact, some of the most important ones are held still behind closed doors. The other issue here is how many people have access to the kind of resources in order to travel to 5 INCs and beyond in countries where you have some of the highest rates of living. The populations that have access to visas versus countries who have, you know, whether it's countries having, you know, barriers to, let's call it what it is, having barriers because of systemic racism, having barriers because they live in predominantly non-white societies. Whether you're in a predominantly brown or a Black society, you don't speak English maybe as your first language, so you don't have access to the kind of applications in order to get to that accreditation. During the INC process, this process has been translated into a minimum amount of internationally spoken languages. That definitely leaves out Indigenous communities who should be at the front and foremost of these conversations. And in a time of a global pandemic, you have restrictions when it comes to COVID. Vaccine apartheid has kept people from attending these conversations, not because there's some massive conspiracy around vaccines, but because they simply don't have the refrigeration, they don't have the medical access. And so something as simple that you and I can walk to a pharmacy and get is so much of a barrier to even having conversations at the international level. And lastly, I'd agree wholeheartedly with Serene in saying the shifting of priorities by major global powers who have a vested interest and could possibly make a profit through inaction or business as usual tactics, and tend to get this treaty to focus on the waste end of issues, whether it's oceans or at least away from transparency, away from toxics. The US is a major power dynamic, and its alignment with other countries like the UAE and China and other big producers definitely have more leverage in these conversations than smaller island countries, thinking about the Cook Islands, whose existence and culture depends on having access to clean waters and clean food resources. So there's a power dynamic that is present through and throughout, and it does rely on who has the most resources, who has the most access, not just to the process, to the language, to vaccines, and so on and so forth. And the last hurdle to this that I would say, because we've experienced it so extremely, has been, you know, a lot of conversations around extraction, a lot of conversations about consumption. A pinpoint that folks tend to leave out is water. And water still hasn't embedded itself fully in something like the Global Plastics Treaty. If you understand how much of a water suck something like plastic is, I can give you just a snapshot. There's an Exxon Sabic plastics facility slated to be built in Corpus Christi. It's about a $10 billion plant. On the daily, this facility needs 20 million gallons of fresh water. That amount of fresh water could supply 120,000 households at the residential level. That's here in the US. So seeing the stress on natural resources here, I can only imagine what's going on in other parts of the world that are experiencing extreme drought. So access, the shifting of priorities, and not fully understanding the impact of how we are affecting the very limited and finite resources we have.
Thank you. That's very important, Pat. David, you want to talk a little bit about hurdles? What do you see as some of the major hurdles?
So I think the major hurdle is something that I mentioned before, is our continued dependence in fossil fuel and the incommensurate power that fossil fuel companies still hold over our society and over the position of many of the governments. And these companies and countries have experienced 30 years of experience in derailing international negotiations around climate and others, and they're putting that into effect here. So that's I would say one of the major hurdles. Another hurdle, and I'm taking a bit of a broader bird's eye view approach here, is multilateralism in general is in crisis. I mean, the world order that came out of World War II is being strongly contested, and for good reason. By no means do I want to say that that world order is fair or equitable. But what that means is that a lot of the issues that are a lot of some of the emerging countries that are trying to challenge that particular world order, a lot of those issues will spill over into a power struggle that in the end has very little to do with plastics. And this is part of what we're seeing in the negotiations, where we see an unholy alliance of many of the very authoritarian governments and countries around the world. And those countries, in turn, are some of the least susceptible to public pressure and public change. And so that creates a particular hurdle. I do not want to end our conversation just on a hurdle, because I also want to give us something about hopes. And I do want to pinpoint and mention that those changes that we're seeing around the world, we're also seeing parallel kinds of changes in society and in the movements around there. We are seeing, since a few years or decade, an unbelievable engagement and alliance from scientists who are getting out of their labs, getting out of their academy to not only glue themselves to roads or airfields, but also engage in policy, engage in the space where decisions are taken. We're seeing a strong empowerment movement of indigenous communities, of Fenceline communities. We're seeing youth rising up and having their voice rise up and demanding to be heard in those spaces that are usually reserved for older men like myself, I would say. And that is really something that is indeed giving me hope. And all of this really contributes to shifting the force line. I mentioned before that a number of the opposing countries are not really susceptible to changes, to pressure from their national citizens but still, the change, the momentum that we've seen around plastic over the past 10 years is quite unbelievable. Believe me, I was one of the first people to start talking about the possibility of having a global treaty that could look at the whole life cycle. And as close as 4 or 5 years ago, people looked at me and looked at us, Cyrene and Yvette, as, oh yeah, and when was the last time you met Santa Claus? I mean, that was the same kind of idea. And now it's real. We have 180 countries that are coming together. We have hundreds of civil society organizations. We have a scientist coalition that brings together more than 900 scientists that come together and advocate. And this is what we're discussing. And so that change, the impact that we all together can have on the world is real. And I think this should give us hope. And I see there's also one question in the Q&R box that asks, what is the most useful thing that people can do to advance and to change that? And my response would be on this, as in many other things, is organize, coordinate, create movement, force, talk about this around yourself, but organize with people like you and people that are very much unlike you, but who share a similar interest in creating a living planet for ourselves and for the next generations.
Thank you, David. I think that perhaps Yvette and Serena might want to also comment on where is the hope? What's looking good? What's possible? What makes you keep going? Yvette, where do you find your hope?
I find hope in that, organizations like mine and so many others have the opportunity because of organizations like Gaia and CL who have shoved that door open and said, no, we're not going to just be the only ones in this room. We're going to have people who are affected present at these negotiations, speaking for themselves. My hope is in that we still have an option to tackle toxics. We still have the option to tackle production. It's still on the table. It hasn't gotten eliminated or diminished. And that's despite of what the US State Department would love to have you believe, that they're only going to tackle this from a waste end. So as far as where I get my hope from is it's still there, it's still alive, it's still burning, and everyday folks can get engaged by organizing, by tweeting, by, hey, hassling, the US State Department. And I'll drop a Twitter if you want to just like tweet at the US State Department and say, we really want toxics to be an issue. We want waste to be an issue. We want, no chemical recycling to perpetuate false solutions. We want you to tackle this throughout the entire live stream. So I'll drop those Twitter handles down.
Looks like maybe
Thanks.
Charles is frozen. Serene, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. I think David really touched on it for me and Yvette. I mean, my hope is the people that are by our side in those negotiation rooms and in all the work in between the negotiation sessions. A lot of people were skeptical about us having a treaty to negotiate at all, and so as hard as it may seem, I think that we have every reason to keep pushing for a strong and ambitious treaty. I think also that we have come to a point where there is widespread awareness of the need for system change and the awareness that that kind of system change is possible. We have seen with the pandemic tremendous public funds being mobilized for coherent policies around public health. So we know that if the political will is there, change is possible. The arguments of there's not enough budget, etc., they don't really hold up to the recent facts. And so between organizing, between the alliance of scientists and academics and frontline communities and environmental groups to educate and hold accountable policymakers for the decisions they make, give me hope. Precedents like the Tobacco Convention, where the tobacco industry was not allowed to participate in the negotiations, in the COPs, gives me hope. That's something we should be able to do for other industries that have been shown to interfere with regulation to protect the environment. And I think that for the fossil fuels and petrochemicals industry, there is no shortage of evidence of the way in which they have worked to suppress something as simple as a ban on single-use plastic bags, even though plastic bags aren't such a big volume of their production. But that gives me hope. Thank you.
Thank you for those. That gives me hope. All of you give me hope as well. David, in the United States, a lot of PFAS regulations happened in states due to the litigation of some of the manufacturers that were using PFAS. Do you see litigation as a possible tool in going against the manufacturers of plastics?
Yes, I mean, let's be clear. Plastic is so pervasive, and it is proposed, and it's so pervasive in every aspect of our life that there is no silver bullet solution where we can say, hey, and even the treaty, I mean, the treaty is going to be instrumental in helping us getting away from the death trap we're setting ourselves in with plastics. But that won't be enough. We will need citizen watch. We will need to use litigation to ensure that companies are held accountable. We will need engineers, inventors, and citizens to come up with new systems to organize themselves, to produce and distribute food and services and clothing and whatever else we use plastic for. And so, yes, litigation can play an important role and will be playing an important role, just as we're currently seeing litigation is playing an important role, is trying to hold the fossil fuel companies accountable. But again, we need to use every single arrow in our I'm trying to translate from French now, and that's not going to work. We need to use every single measures at our disposal to have a chance to get at this particular issue.
And one more question for you, David. The United Nations Secretary General once commented that the industry had too much influence on UN negotiations. Was there any kind of follow-up on that to kind of limit industry input? As we've seen, it's pretty deadly in terms of the climate summits and also the plastics treaty.
Well, the three speakers that you have on this panel are actively working towards this, and part of the way to do this is to expose that influence, because once it's exposed, it shrinks into the light. It doesn't like light, and once it's exposed, it tends to fall back a little. Another way to do this is to identify and show precedents of how we've managed to do this. Cyrine mentioned the tobacco control convention that was signed under the auspices of the World Health Organization. Well, in that convention, it clearly excludes companies that profit from tobacco to participate in the implementation, the setting up of the rules and the implementation of the rules that are being adopted. So it can be done. But yeah, that is also something that we're all actively working on.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, there's a lot of hope here. Do you have questions for each other or comments that you would like to address to another one of your fellow panelists? Does anybody have a question for David or for Serena or Yvette that you would like to ask now? Yvette, would you have a question for David or Serena, for example?
Sure, I have a question that I know I had at the beginning of the treaty process, and it's for Serene. You know, a lot of people who imagine someone who is a waste picker who makes their money out of basically collecting plastic would say, well, wouldn't this hurt those kinds of economies?
Thanks, Yvette. So the waste pickers that Guy I work with tell us that, you know, plastics has never been a huge source of income for them, right? Because they get paid by weight. Plastics are lightweight. The most valuable items that they collect and that they get income from are cans, for instance. So, you know, what we're hearing from them is, you know, you want to cut plastics, first of all, those that are not truly recyclable, and that is the vast majority of plastic products produced today. Those are a cost to them. So they're asking us to help us curb those, right? Because when they collect waste, they have to sort, and they will only get income for what they can sell at a fair price, right? Then even for the recyclable plastics, there's so much plastic production today that the going price for even a PET plastic bottle, the poster child of plastic recycling, is very low, right? So they're not really, it's more of a burden on them than a real source of income. So yeah, they've been very supportive, and they're also obviously acutely aware of the amount of toxic exposure they get because they're handling materials every day that have, like we said earlier, a lot of chemicals, a lot of toxics, and they don't even have the basic information about the risks that they're exposing themselves to through their work. And finally, you know, one thing we didn't talk about today, but that we all work on is a just transition for workers and communities affected by plastics, both informal workers and formal workers. And what that might look like for waste pickers can include transition to green jobs that are way safer and higher value in economic terms than picking plastic waste. There are jobs in reuse, there are jobs in repair, of durable goods that are valued much higher in a society and would give them safer and higher livelihoods. And no waste picker I know wants their children to pick waste from a landfill or from the streets. They don't want that future. They want a way out.
Okay, thank you. In terms of being fair, I'm going to forward to you some questions that have appeared. Will the treaty address the disproportionate health harms of plastics through the life cycle on marginalized communities and outline measures to better protect these populations? Is there something concrete in that direction? Who would like to take that on?
I would just repeat what I had said earlier. If you look at some of those obligations 1, 2, and 3, there's a clear pathway with how tackling some of those toxics that impact, throughout the entire life stream of the plastics life cycle. So that would be, right, cutting useless plastics, things that don't even make a contribution into society. They outline basically following and tracking toxic plastics. If you have somewhere being exported or imported, having clear labels on what they are, having the volumes, having their origins, having what they should and should not be used for. Because a lack of information is what our society really struggles with. We don't know what we should be protecting ourselves from because we don't know the harms that they can potentially pose.
Sorry, we have a poor connection here, I think, today. So I apologize for that. Does anybody else want to comment on that previous question, or should I go on to another one? Let me ask you this. In the final text, which would hypothetically consist of only 3 elements or targets, which ones would you prioritize? This is from Ulises Bobadilla y Jimenez.
So I tried to provide a quick response in writing, and then I realized that I wrote the response below another question. So I just repasted it where it was. But I would say the 3 things that I would look at primarily are supply side measures to reduce production. Basically, we need to produce less plastics. And right now, until now, the world has been trying to do this by addressing the demand side, by banning this kind of plastic, the use of plastic in this kind of material or this kind of uses, etc. And it doesn't work. The production of plastic continues to rise. So the first priority thing is for the treaty to give us the tools and mechanism to strengthen an approach that would effectively address the production of primary plastics. So that would be my first big choice and the thing that we've been focusing on. The second one is detoxifying the whole plastic, people say life cycle, but I prefer to call it death cycle. So really detoxifying that whole cycle from the production to the disposal of plastic is key, and it's essential because it will be essential to reduce the impacts that plastic have on human health and on the environment. Plus, it would facilitate finding ways to deal in a way that is sustainable with whatever plastic we end up continuing to produce, because we're not going to stop plastic production altogether. We're going to keep on producing. At least we need to produce much, much less. The numbers are probably around 75% less than what we're producing in 2019 to even give us a chance to stay in the 1.5 degree objective of the Paris Treaty. But that means that we'll still be producing some plastic, and that plastic need to be detoxified so we can know how to deal with it, and so that the Fenceline communities all around the chain are not impacted, including workers and others. And the third point, because this is a little pet thing of mine over the past 15 years, is have a strong financial mechanism that actually implements the polluter pays principle. It is impossible for us to believe that we will implement all the measures that we need to do to create a just transition outside of the plastic economy without strong financial resources. And those financial resources cannot and should not only be coming from taxpayers' monies from all around the world. Some companies are making literal trillions out of producing these materials, and the polluter pays principle was internationally recognized as early as 1992, but we have never been able to actually implement and operationalize it. And so that would be my choice for the third key aspect or the key element of the treaty.
Yvette or Sarita, do you want to respond to that question? Or do you want to add anything to David's response? Okay. And just one last question, I think, and then I'll turn it back to Kristen. How do we ensure the countries that sign on actually implement the treaty? What kind of follow-up is there going to be? I know there's always a request for national reports, which has happened in other UN treaties. Sometimes countries report, sometimes they do not, and sometimes we don't know whether they're telling the truth. Or sometimes we don't know whether they need help to implement. What are the devices do you see, David, to make this treaty actually workable on the ground because it's being observed and supported?
So another pet project of CL and something that we've been working on for some time is to ensure that the treaty includes strong trade mechanism and trade measures. Plastic is traded all around the world. The fossil fuels are extracted and then traded internationally. Then we produce plastic precursors that are themselves traded internationally to produce a plastic material that is traded internationally, to produce plastic products that are being traded internationally. And once we throw those away, the wastes, again, are being traded internationally. And we know that trade mechanism around the world have some of the stronger compliance mechanism than some environmental international approaches. So looking at the trade side is very important. And another key aspect of this, and that responds to another question that I saw in the Q&A box, is that some people believe that this treaty can only be effective if every country in the world subscribe and ratifies it. Well, we believe that they're actually, first of all, it's impossible. Some countries will never ratify it, either because their internal domestic policy makes it impossible to ratify an international treaty, including for a country that I will not name, but I will say is located between Mexico and Canada, or because some countries derive so much of their power, international geopolitical power and domestic power from petrochemical production, such as Saudi Arabia, for example. If we get to a treaty that they can sign up to, it will mean that the treaty will be weak and ineffective. So, but however, you can include, there are legal ways to include trade measures to regulate trade between parties and non-parties that would still carry a very strong impact for those countries that do not ratify and do not become members of the, do not become a party. We see that with the Basel Convention. Almost all of the countries are parties to the Basel Convention, except, again, the US. However, because parties are forbidden to trade hazardous waste with non-parties, the US finds itself in a position where, while nationally it is allowed to trade its waste and send it, hazardous waste, and send it anywhere, no one is internationally allowed to buy it. And so you can create, by using trade measures and party to non-party measures, you can create a strong compliance system. Of course, there are other legal mechanisms to ensure compliance, and we're working on this. Some elements, the zero draft, are currently relatively weak, but we're working on this. On the trade, on the party to non-party trade mechanism, I've put in the responses to the question a reference to a study that we've published recently that shows both example of how it can be done, how it has been done in other international treaties, and why it actually needs to be done.
Also, to add to that, if we don't get something done under this administration, when is our next opportunity to have an administration that is not only understanding or says that they're understanding of environmental justice concerns, but they say that they're understanding of general public concerns when it comes to toxics and recalls. And this brings us to, I just wanted to touch on the EPA question in the Q&A. Where is the EPA on plastic, which is currently out of control regarding our exposure and potentially affecting our health? That's a great question, because in the Federal Register, for folks following it, that there have been updates to things like TSCA, that's the Toxic Substance Control Act. And through TSCA, they have had, open comment periods, but it hasn't been as robust or ambitious as even we have wanted, which is why so many of our organizations are focused on the Global Plastics Treaty, because there is no enforcement. Who oversees the federal government? Who oversees the EPA? We need something larger that extends outside of our boundaries to really address this issue. Unfortunately, EPA doesn't even have enough investigators to keep up with an endless list of chemicals that are reaching our store shelves. So if the research is there, if other countries have more information, which we know so much of the toxics database already accepted in the European Union is, we're talking about chemicals that have been banned in other countries that continue appearing on our store shelves, in our children's hands, in our homes every single day. So you're right, the EPA is behind. Something like a Global Plastics Treaty could thrust us into modern day understanding of toxics and plastics and its impacts in our everyday lives.
Serene, do you want to comment? Thank you, Yvette. Right on. All right, then. I think that we've reached a time limit here. There's still some very good questions, and hopefully we'll go to them, but I'll turn it over to Kristen now to guide us on through.
I think we do have time, Serene. I saw you unmuting yourself if you wanted to share a few words in response to Charles' question, or no?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to talk about, for implementation, the other bit that really matters is finance. And for us, it's really important that the finance from the treaty prioritizes and focuses on compliance with key measures, and that the funds are distributed in line with the waste hierarchy, i.e. the most money for production controls, upstream controls, our top 3 important measures, right? Upstream, reducing the quantity of plastics produced, cleaning up the toxics, and banning all of the plastic products and materials that we know pose the greatest risk, whether that's because of impact on biodiversity, because they're food contact materials, because they are particularly likely to emit microplastics, right? And that goes into, we often think about packaging, that goes into textile, folks. Half of the textiles produced today are plastics, and they are shedding microplastics from the moment we make them through the time we wear them, when we wash them, and then they get dumped, often exported as secondhand clothes and end up in places like the Atacama Desert. And these microplastics I'm pregnant, these plastics are today in my placenta, they're in my blood, they are threatening my child. So I would say that is absolutely important. What we don't want finance to go to is just more waste management, right? The treaty can set the bar for safe waste management for plastics, but it shouldn't be a channel to build more incinerators, more dump sites. It shouldn't be a channel to build out false solutions that don't work, like chemical recycling and pyrolysis. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, Chris.
I could add here, Cheryl.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
In these conversations, I would love to for folks to also understand the impact it disproportionately places within your own family dynamic. thinking about who is the individual taking the majority of the household work, who are the majority of individuals going to the grocery store, using those supplies firsthand. You know, disproportionately, we see that's women having these exposures, or having working class folks really be folks in our kitchens using these chemicals, increasing exposure. So although you in your everyday life might not see those kinds of toxics and say, well, I'm making good decisions for myself, that's just not across the board, because not everyone has access to safer alternatives. So yes, individual action is important. Corporate accountability is more important, and thrusting ourselves into the conversation regardless is probably the most important. Thank you.
Thank you.
That seems like a good note to end on. So I want to thank you all so much, our panelists, for sharing your perspectives with us today, and for your incredibly important work to make this global treaty as strong and effective as it can be. Thank you for that. And many thanks to Charles for leading us through this conversation today. I wanted to also thank our team of interpreters and all of today's participants for your thoughtful questions and engagement. Please keep an eye out for future webinars in this series. We hope you'll join us for those discussions as well. And I have just a few quick announcements as we wrap up. First, a video recording will be available on Che's website soon of this conversation. And as I mentioned, everyone who registered for today's session will receive an email with the link to the video. We also invite you to join us for an upcoming EDC Strategies Partnership webinar on Thursday, November 16th. It will be a discussion of recent science linking PFAS exposure to increased risk of testicular cancer among members of the U.S. Air Force. You'll find the link to register on our homepage, and we'll drop that link in the chat now as well. Many thanks to Che's Senior Science and Policy Advisor, Rachel Massey, for her behind-the-scenes support. And thanks once again to all of our panelists and to today's moderator. And finally, thanks to all of you who joined us today. We hope you found this information useful. We look forward to seeing you again soon on future webinars.